Welcome back to Exegetical Tools Basic Greek videos. In this video we're looking at the perfect, middle, and passive indicative. The middle and passive for the perfect indicative are the same forms, they're not different, so this is just one paradigm. And it's actually building off the perfect active indicative, so if you have not watched the perfect active indicative video yet, or if you don't know the perfect active indicative at all, you need to go back and watch that video and learn it first, because I'm assuming a lot of information from that lesson. So the perfect middle passive indicative is basically going to function, it's going to be very similar to the perfect active indicative, but it will have a different stem. It has its own stem, perfect passive, as opposed to the perfect active. And then it's got no connecting vowel. That's the biggest thing. See right here, there's no connecting vowel. And then it's going to use the primary middle passive endings instead of the primary active. But it actually makes for a very easy paradigm because there's no connecting vowel. It's the primary middle passive personal endings. Some people call them the primary B endings. My, psi, tai, methus, they, ontai. And as we'll see, there's not even a contraction that occurs in the second singular. So this is a pretty simple paradigm to learn. Now, everything I said about verbal aspect from the perfect active video is the same, applies here as well. That means that I'm going to consider it the state of aspects, but as I said in the previous video, in the perfect active video, the verbal aspect debate on the perfect tense is still up in the air. The dust is not settled, and so there's various ways to handle the perfect tense at this point. I think generally a translation that emphasizes a state is usually the better translation for many perfects, but perhaps not all. The perfect middle passive reduplicates according to the same rules as the perfect active. Remember, there were multiple rules for the reduplication, and those all apply here. The perfect middle passive is the fifth principal part listed in lexicons. Lexicons won't always list all the principal parts, so maybe a better term here would be something like in the grammars, because grammars usually have a section where they list the principal parts of less common or more irregular verbs, and so you can look at that list and memorize the principal parts of certain verbs that are very irregular and that you would never be able to figure out in context by just looking at it. So if you are looking in something like that, it's the fifth principal part would be the perfect middle passive, and it'll of course be the first singular form of it. So for luo, it would be lelumai would be the principal part for luo. As I said, notice that the second person singular form is actually psi. So you memorize those actual endings, my, psi, tai, methus, they, ontai, but usually that psi contracts, the sigma drops out, the ua contracts to a, and then the iota subscripts. But in this case, that does actually not happen. You actually keep the psi, so you have the psi on the second person singular, lelusai. So you get lelumai, lelusai, lelutai. It's nice. You actually get to say all the forms with the actual endings. And as I said, notice there's no connecting vowel. The same is true with the perfect middle and passive stem and the morphemes for the infinitive and the participle. So with the infinitive, perfect middle passive, and the perfect middle passive participle, there's no connecting vowel. So that's something to remember. That's something that kind of marks the middle passive as distinctive, the lack of a connecting vowel. And then if the stem ends in a vowel, it's usually going to lengthen before the ending. So these are contract vowels, something like martureo. See how martureo ends in epsilon, the stem does. And that stem, you can see right here, memarturamai, the epsilon has lengthened to an eta. So that happens before the ending. That's a pretty common thing to happen with contract vowels. It happens also, for example, with the aorist tense when you add the sigma tense formative. If If it's a contract vowel, that contract vowel will lengthen before the sigma. Same thing with the future tense as well. Last thing, the last thing is that if the stem ends in a consonant, there are going to be various changes that occur to ease pronunciation. There's too many to just list here, and you wouldn't memorize them anyway. And so it's best to just learn these by observation. So if you see, for example, if you see one occur in context, seeing something in context is the best way to memorize it. So you may be able to learn how a certain verb changes, or how consonants change, or how different words decline, just by seeing it in context and remembering. That's usually the best way to do it. You could also set up flashcards if you like to try and remember certain changes. Now let's look at the paradigm together. This is the full paradigm, and remember, this is the middle and the passive forms. Oh, sorry about that. These are the middle and the passive forms. Notice that you don't have the kappa or anything like that from the active. So that's one way to be able to distinguish from the active tense stem, is that you have the reduplication, and so then you think, oh, so this is perfect, but is it active or middle passive? Well, one way is to see that there's no kappa. Another way is to see that you're using these primary middle passive endings. That's another way to notice. And there's no connecting vowel, there's no alpha, anything like that, so this is quite different. Now, as far as the actual paradigm, you've seen the constituent parts. It's got the reduplication, it's got the stem, which is the middle, perfect middle passive stem, which you can find from the fifth principal part. And then you got the personal endings. My, sai, tai, methus, the untai. Second person singular does not change. So, to say these, we would say, if you want to say it together with me, lelumai, start again, lelumai, lelusai, lelutai, lelumatha, lelustha, leluntai. Those are the various forms, and the basic translation I'm giving it here. Remember all the caveats I gave about translation in the perfect active video. The basic translation is I have been loosed. So I have been loosed. That generally, in English, what that signifies is, if this is the present, it generally means I have been loosed. It happened back here, and the results are ongoing to the present and into the foreseeable future, or at least to the present, and then the future is unknown. So that's what this translation generally signifies, and that may not get across the best idea, because it does seem to emphasize this past occurrence, whereas it may be true that most or all of perfect tense verbs in Greek are trying to emphasize a current state or something like that. I don't know how you write a state, but a state of being, like I know, something like that. I'm in the state of knowing right now. So anyway, that's just the caveat on the translations. You have been loosed. He or she or he, it has been loosed. We have been loosed, etc. So what's the best way to go about memorizing this? Same way as usual. First of all, memorize the constituent parts. Memorize that there is a reduplication, and that there is that you use the perfect passive tense stem, and that you use the primary middle passive personal endings. If you know those three things about this form, then you should be able to stitch together all the different forms, if you remember that the second person singular does not contract. It's lelusai. So, if you write these out, however you do this, perhaps you like to write them out, perhaps you like to say them out loud, perhaps you like to make flashcards, however you do it. But one of the best ways is to simply write them out. Lelumai, something like this, lelusai. And I'm doing this now in the hopes that this might help it stick in your brain. Oh, sorry again, lelumatha. And you can put in accents if you want, if it helps you pronounce it. Lelustha and leluntai. there you have it, the whole paradigm. And if you want, when you write it out, you can, you can separate them if you want, like I do here, something like this. I have a little space here to show me the constituent parts. You can do that if you want. You don't have to. Anyway, that's the perfect middle passive indicative. Hope that was helpful, and I'll see you next time.